Oh man. Scott Walker gives me anxiety. A very brash statement, I'm aware, for a video title, but I truly do not know how to simplistically tell you guys in just a sentence the reaction I get when I listen to Scott Walker. But before I get into that subject matter, let me give you just a quick little rundown of who Scott Walker is. Noel Scott Angle, aka Scott Walker, was originally a part of the pop rock group from the mid-60s called the Walker Brothers. Oddly enough, none of these individuals were brothers, nor were their last names Walker. In the time span of only 2 years from 1965 to 1967, the Walker Brothers would release 4 full-length albums, that being Take It Easy with the Walker Brothers, Introducing the Walker Brothers, Portrait, and Images. They would end up finding quite a bit of mainstream success, considering the fact that these albums came out in the mid-60s, they're playing in the style of rock and roll and rock pop, and the Walker Brothers during this time, their age was roughly around like their early 20s. That was being a lot of an appeal to that of young girls and teenagers, considering the fact that a lot of their lyrical themes have to do with like the lovey-dovey romance type of stuff, that it's nothing I would say that is horrendous or bad. If anything, some of the tracks are pretty catchy. It was basically following the guidelines to what a lot of other successful rock bands were doing during that time, that it basically radiates the same vibe and energy to something like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. However, that success would come to an abrupt end for the Walker Brothers as they ended up disbanding in 1968. Of the 3 members, Scott Walker was the only individual that ended up finding any form of success in a solo career. His first 3 albums being Scott, Scott 2, and Scott 3, I know, really easy album titles to remember, were much more in vein of like these extravagant and larger than life sounding pop ballads, that you'll notice that Scott Walker's vocal performance was a lot more matured and robust. That typically when it comes to me researching for a topic and going kind of like out of bounds a little bit to listen to albums to really kind of like gather more information, I gotta be honest, these albums are honestly really incredible how they are written, and showcases that in just such a short amount of time how individuals can change their overall songwriting for the better. And for Scott Walker, it was shown on these 3 full-length albums. In interviews, Scott Walker would state that one of his big inspirations for this change in style would be the works from Jacques Brel, which, yeah, there are some similarities, only I do feel like Scott Walker took this approach of like this extravagant pop opera type of style to a whole new level that Jacques Brel could not reach. But when it came to Scott Walker's 4th full-length solo album titled, you guessed it, Scott 4, this is where he hit a roadblock. In terms of sales, this album performed quite poorly, and a huge reason as to why it really didn't find any kind of audience to help propel its sales better is mainly having to do with the fact that at this time during 1969 of this album's release, this would be Scott Walker at his most experimental. So much so that Scott Walker has stated in interviews a huge reason as to why he thinks this album performed poorly during sales is the fact that he wrote the whole album in the time signature of 3/4. Thus it wouldn't be as anthemic or as catchy to an audience to help them kind of like dance around to it. Thus it kind of faded into obscurity. From that point onwards to 1974, Scott Walker would remain active releasing music, although he would never hit the same amount of relevancy that he had, and thus became inactive writing and releasing music. Or at least that's how it was for his solo career, because in 1975, the Walker Brothers reformed. During this very short-lived reunion, as it would only be from 1975 until 1978, just 3 years, the Walker Brothers would end up releasing 3 full-length albums that would find them having moderate success when you talk about the first 2 reunion albums, as, to be honest, they really didn't do much other than do basically cover songs that ended up having them with some sort of success. But the standout feature about this particular time period that I want to point out here is with their final full-length album titled Night Flights. This is where the gears start turning, I feel like, for Scott Walker anyway. With basically anything he did or was a part of, things would start getting weird. As the story goes with this album is that the label that they were signed to during this time was going under, and basically told the Walker brothers to just let their minds run free, have no restrictions, any ideas that you have, just let loose on this album. And with the punk revolution basically happening all around the world, as this was the late 70s, the Walker brothers would end up creating an album that feels like this hybrid of like this art house abstract take on post-punk, that with the compositions and ambience just engulfing you in this very otherworldly and abstract way. I really do feel like this is the album that got the gears turning for Scott Walker to really start thinking outside the box with really any of his future works. And from there on out, the Walker brothers would call it quits for good. As for the solo efforts of Scott Walker, he would remain silent for roughly around a decade until seemingly out of nowhere in 1984, he would release an album called Climate of Hunter. Compared to everything previous of Scott Walker's solo works, Climate of Hunter is dramatically different, as all of these like pop and classical influences have completely evaporated, and now we're getting to territory where it's just basically avant-garde to its purest form. All the while, there are individuals who state this album as an art rock piece of music, which, to be blunt, I don't really feel like it gives this album justice as to what particularly it is, other than I feel like individuals are trying to find some sort of familiarity by adding in these genre tags and labels, because I don't really know what to call this album, and neither does Scott Walker, as some interviews you can find online when he's talking about this album's release, he discusses it in a way that he himself isn't really trying to appeal to the pop, or rock audience anymore, nor does he outright state what this style of music really is. And when it comes to his overall songwriting process for it, it refers to it as there's these big gaps as to why these albums take so long to release, as again, he was silent for 10 years because he was waiting for all of these ideas and styles of music to just kind of come to him naturally. So it's really quite difficult to almost nearly impossible from like his standpoint to what we're hearing to really label this as a particular piece of music that we're familiar with. Thus again, this is where Scott Walker overall starts becoming a really huge figure for just avant-garde music as a whole. Yet soon after this album's release, Scott Walker would fade right back into obscurity, and he would remain silent releasing music for 11 years until 1995 when he released the album Tilt. We finally reached the point in this video that's all about the title for it, Scott Walker Gives Me Anxiety, because from here on out, all of Scott's work becomes so much less in vein of something that would be accessible and radio friendly, and way more in the realms of something that's like this surrealist, abstract nightmare. Which is another thing to point out here during this time, is that I feel like when individuals find a lot of fascination with Scott Walker's work, and for me at least anyway with the video title of Why It Gives Me Anxiety, is I'm primarily focusing all of the late era Scott Walker, or the albums that were a part of his trilogy, that of course being Tilt, The Drift that came out in 2006, and Bish Bosch that came out in 2012. That being said, of the 3 full-length albums that's a part of this, I guess, avant-garde trilogy of Scott Walker's work, Tilt is what I would consider to be the easiest of the 3 to listen to, but make no mistake about it, there still are a lot of portions within this album that give me this uneasy feeling. One of the features that I notice about this particular album is that there's more of like this mechanical and dismal type of production value to it that almost feels like in certain parts on the album it kind of goes into like industrial territory. One of those tracks on this album that I feel like is a great introduction to at least get yourself in the right mindset for this album would be The Cockfighter. This track, along with really anything that you can name from late era Scott Walker's work, utilizes a lot of juxtapositions. There's a documentary I ended up watching a handful of days ago called Scott Walker, the 30th Century Man. It's a very well put together documentary that I would recommend to really any music fan to watch, that has a lot of rare footage of Scott Walker with interviews, which at this time he was still kind of like this reclusive individual. So to actually have like a full-on documentary of his work that runs for roughly around a little over 90 minutes is quite significant. And what's really interesting to hear is Scott Walker talking about his writing process when it came to albums like Tilt and The Drift. And when it comes to his process, at least on Tilt anyway, and again it's very similar to his future works, is that he utilizes juxtapositions, but in the sense that one instrument's going to be played, in a higher volume, another instrument will be played at a lower volume, and his vocals will be right in the middle. Having that approach and structure with his songwriting, at least from my experiences when I listen to Scott Walker's work, really does give me like that anxiety-inducing feeling, because I'm having such a difficult time trying to find balance with all of it, as if I'm waiting for those 3 points to kind of like fall in line. Thus the melody and rhythm and all the things that I'm familiar with music norms makes sense to me now, and it just never does. And it really transcends his overall approach from avant-garde music, that it doesn't really follow the rule book of what music is, yet it's still considered, at least to him, to be music, to be songs, to have some sort of structure with it that's just so abnormal that it really truly embodies what avant-garde is at this point. And while there are obviously other musicians and artists out there that can be labeled as like an avant-garde rock band or an avant-garde metal band or an avant-garde, jazz or pop, whatever, they're still following a rule book and guidelines to that specific genre. Whereas with Scott Walker, when it comes to Tilt, The Drift, and Bish Bosch, he's following no rules but his own. 11 years later, in 2006, he would release the second album in this trilogy titled The Drift. From my personal viewpoint, this is Scott Walker at his most unhinged and wildest, that it really becomes quite the challenge to listen to from beginning to end. Everything he did on Tilt, it's like as if he just made it all the more abysmal, all the more dense, and all the more abstract, which is quite impressive within itself. But god damn, I cannot state how many times I've tried listening to this album, and every single time I can just feel my insides turn inside out, the hairs on the back of my neck start sticking up, and I really just feel like I wish I had eyes in the back of my head to just ease my mind, because every little detail about this album is just so, nerve-wracking. Best example that I can give you from this album is the track titled Clara, which oddly enough, it's quite funny that the song on this album that gives me the most amount of stress, titled Clara, just so happens to be the name of my wife, which is just incredibly ironic. What the song Clara is actually in reference to is Clara Petacci. She was a mistress to that of the Italian dictator Mussolini. How this ties all together is that in the documentary Scott Walker, the 30th Century Man, Scott Walker references that when he was, I believe, roughly around the age of 6, his aunt took him to the movie theater. And during that time, they had a lot of newsreels being played in terms of the intermissions of films. And one of those intermissions showcased the newsreel of what happened in Italy, where Mussolini was executed along with his mistress, Clara Petacci. Witnessing those newsreels at such a young age clearly gave Scott Walker a very profound effect that would be macabre and incredibly disturbing. Obviously so much so that he would make a song about it over half a century later. Another detail about this album that I find to be truly unnerving is just Scott Walker's singing overall. It's stripped away from any personality or charisma, and I'm not stating this in an insulting way, but it's incredibly basic. It's just a man, it's just a voice, and that's it. For me personally, what it sounds like is Scott Walker is just lost in this labyrinth of juxtapositions of all these uneven noises that are loud and quiet, these transitions that make absolutely no sense whatsoever, and it's just this freak show that never feels like it's ever coming to an end. As for the songwriting on this album, it's just all over the place that it becomes honestly really disorienting. Take for example some of the stringed instruments like violins being played on this album, that it becomes quite minimalistic considering the fact that it only has at parts one string being played for 16 bars straight, thus it almost feels like it goes on endlessly one note at a time. Then there's all the orchestral work that gets quite complex on this album, that it really starts becoming more and more disorienting to the point that it's just like spiraling out of control. It's like you almost wish it would just stop so you can get back to your senses, essentially, is what it gives off. To the point then, at some parts on this album, I believe there's just a donkey that goes off, that it becomes really disorienting and quite irritating to listen to. That I remember the first time I heard this album, it gave me like a jump scare for the first time ever with a musical experience. Along with other very unorthodox instruments being played on this album, again, a lot of it you can witness on the Scott Walker documentary, where they utilize basically a meat and just punch it into a microphone, and thus they use it for percussions, to using a steel pipe and a hammer for other rhythm sections, to even building this kind of like big wooden box and slamming a steel garbage bin over it to create other different like percussions for the album. Again, it kind of leans into some sense with late era Scott Walker into the realms of industrial. Whether he meant it or not, who knows, but I always found that really interesting if you watch the documentary. As we reach the final inclusion in the Scott Walker trilogy, that being Bish Bosch, released in 2012, at face value it's basically a continuation of The Drift with the kind of like surreal and abstract nature of everything. The difference being that I still find The Drift to be definitely more frightening, whereas Bish Bosch tends to have a lot more bells and whistles added to it. It almost sounds a bit more erratic and sparse on how the transition and overall songwriting is, that it kind of becomes almost in a sense electrifying how unorthodox and avant-garde it gets, that it really kind of goes into a completely different dimension, that again, it's quite impossible to label what this is other than just experimental music. Don't get me wrong though, this album still gives me that very uneasy and anxious type of feeling, mainly because I just have such a difficult time deciphering what this exactly is. There's no familiarity of any genre that I'm aware of being played on it. For a lot of people that are aware of this album, it seems like they describe it in a sense that it's only something that Scott Walker can do. And not just because, he thinks outside the box and he's just a weirdo of all these other different musicians out there, but it's the fact too, when you look at just his life, considering the fact that at this point in 2012, he would roughly be somewhere around his late 60s, I believe, when he recorded this. It just feels as if this is an individual that has gone through so many experiences in his life and kind of just like marinated his ideas and musical integrity down this abyss of ideas that no one dares to go down, and makes something like this seem just normal. Thus, it just becomes so abstract from really anything else you can compare this to, that I've looked endlessly, I feel like, for albums that are similar to this, and all I really get are just albums that are labeled experimental that nowhere come close to the unnatural nature of anything you will hear on Bish Bosch. Which I guess kind of leads into as to why I labeled this video as such, and as to why I get these extreme reactions with these albums is, you know, like the first time you hear a style of music that's either extreme or abstract, you never forget that moment. You feel so kind of like pulverized by how abstract or extreme music can be. And in that moment, you think nothing else is like it. And it's until you realize when you pursue onwards to these styles of music that there's a scene, there's similar artists to it, and you become so immersed with it that it becomes a norm to you. Whereas with Scott Walker's work, there is no scene. There's nothing similar to it that I can find. Thus, it feels so alien to me. And because of that, I just don't have comfort trying to be familiar with what's going on here. Thus, I get this kind of like anxiety-inducing feeling whenever I listen to Scott Walker's work. And it's just truly something unique, one of a kind, that only Scott Walker can do. I also find it just so fascinating too, I guess, as to why I find this music so unique, is that when you look at the life of Scott Walker, to go from like this high point in like, you know, the realms of pop music where he was like almost like mainstream success, he was on the level with that like the Beatles and such, to just steadily go down a downward spiral into like this rabbit hole and abyss of just experimentation and very unorthodox music, that there's no other individual that I can think of that's gone down this sort of like timeline and life events. And I think it's a humongous reason looking at his, you know, history, which is why I talked about it for a good portion in this video, to truly understand as to how all of this kind of like experimental stuff came to be and why it's so significant and unorthodox. While I'm aware that Scott Walker also did other albums around the 21st century, I believe he did a handful of soundtracks and even did a collaboration with Sun that is overall interesting, but nothing I would find to be kind of like frightening or that much of a freak show from the Trilogy albums. Is definitely worth checking out. But I can't, again, strongly recommend enough for individuals who are looking for something truly avant-garde to the fullest extent as the Trilogy albums that Scott Walker did from 1995 to 2012 with Tilt, The Drift, and Bish Bosch. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, everything I talked about will be linked below in the description for you to check out. Really curious to know what you think of Scott Walker, and if you don't think much of it, what are albums that give you anxiety? What are albums that make you feel unsettled by just how unorthodox they are? Really curious to know. And other than that, guys, that'll do it. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.